Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Christopher. Great being with you.
Yeah, likewise. I really think today's conversation is going to be really valuable for people who feel stuck in regret and hurt and fear. So I'd love to start here, Scott. Why does regret from the past die so hard for us?
Oh boy, that's a great question. As you know from the book that we're probably going to get into in this podcast, sure. I open it with a story about how I'm walking alone, and suddenly these words come out of my mouth, sort of these self-condemning words, and it was about something that happened 37 years ago, about words that I regret saying in high school. And I'm not really sure what it is. You know, I was once listening to an interview with the recording artist Mariah Carey. And one of the things she said in the interview was that she can hear 1,000 praises and one criticism, and the one criticism will weigh more heavily on her heart than the 1,000 praises, and will stick with her a lot longer than the 1,000 praises. And I don't know. I mean, you'll have to ask the true experts on why that is. But just from a theological perspective, as a pastor, which is my primary profession, I can only surmise from my own experience is that I know deep down that I was made for glory and made for magnificence and perfection as somebody made in the image of God, and that's all been tarnished by my fallen nature and by the broken world that we live in, and so things like shame, things like pain and fear of the future were not originally things that we were meant to carry, and so they feel unnatural to us. And because of how unnatural they feel to us, they stick with us because we're so deeply bothered by them, is my only best guess at that. We're so wired to respond heavily to shame and lightly to praise and affirmation. And one sticks with us forever, and the other just seems to leak out of us. And so would love to continue to pursue a conversation with you about that, but it is definitely a dynamic that I think everybody deals with.
Well, let's stay there then. So let's go back to Mariah's statement. 10 million praises, one criticism. What sticks? You and I may not have a clinical answer for this, but let's just go inside your experience then. Why, for you, does the one criticism stick out far more than praise? I have thoughts from my own life and life experiences, but let's just kind of get under the psyche of this a little bit.
So, I've done my own work with counselors, and have a counselor that I work with regularly today. His name is Chip Dodd. He's wonderful. And some of the best counselors will dive into the most formative, kind of early in life and family of origin experiences and how those shape our responses to the world around us for the rest of our lives. And I'm an abuse and trauma survivor from my childhood, and I received, I would say, a disproportionate large volume of what you could call shaming input through the use of words. That sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me phrase never resonated with me.
Oh, it's garbage.
Because
it's total garbage. Yeah.
Yeah. From a very early age, by an important person, authority person in my life, I was told that I was, worthless and, given names that were condemning names. And so knowing how that feels, and in this particular instance that I described to you a minute ago, it was also how in that moment I made somebody else feel. I said something mean to somebody, and that was the thing that I've been hanging on to for 37 years, that I made somebody feel in the same way that somebody else made me feel earlier in life, and I hate the fact that it is within me the potential to make somebody hurt with my words. And so that's why I think that's stuck with me. My greatest regrets in life have to do with words that I wish I could take back.
Wow. If we could for a moment, Scott, let's go back inside those earlier years when you received these wounding words. How did you build scaffolding of ego protection as you grew? So through those 37 years, what did that look like? How did you build the self-protection around yourself out of the experience of those early words? Because as men, I think there's a good chance we could do it differently than women. Yeah. And I'm just curious to hear, because I don't often have this conversation with men, and I'm really intrigued.
It's such a good question. I think, the answer is easy and definitive up to the time I turned 20. So from my childhood until I turned 20 years old, the scaffolding that I put around it, the way that I tried to protect myself from, the negative pronouncements and the negative verdicts, was through achievement. And so I became especially the best athlete that I could, and won state championships and most valuable player awards, and the elite basketball high school player group in the state of Georgia, just stuff like that, in order to counter the narrative that I'm not worth much. And the troubling part of that whole experience was, even as I experienced success, was also president of my fraternity in college, won the, Exceptional Man Award on campus in the college where I went, intramural athlete of the year, all of that stuff, and was never, it never did it. It never fixed that sense of feeling small and not enough. And the thing that changed it, and the thing that began what's now been a 34-year process of change since I was 20, I'm 54 now, was coming into a relationship with Jesus Christ, which several of the guy friends in my life in college showed up for me and introduced me to life in Christ and invited me to share that life with them. And that began a whole new journey of learning what it meant to be valued without having to work for it, without having to make it happen, to receive the pronouncement of dignity that God, my Creator, has already put over me, that I bear His image, that according to the 8th Psalm, I am part of the crown of His creation, as is every human being, whether you believe in Him or not. You're still part of the crown of His creation, made for glory. And of course, belonging to Jesus Christ through faith, I'm also declared by God to be His son, and to have belonging in His family, and that nothing in all creation, even my very worst day and very worst moment, will ever be able to separate me from His love, that there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ. And so those words of God that He pronounces over all of His children and over each of His children have become the counter voice that I have to continue to go back to every single day, because I still get nagged and agitated by that shaming, condemning, negative verdict voice, that inner critic, we could call it. And I have to keep going back on a daily basis to those statements that God has pronounced over all and each of his children, including myself, that those narratives just aren't true, that God sees each of His children in the same way that He sees His Son Jesus, because Jesus has completed the work for us. And so it's a long, circuitous answer, but the love of Christ is the only thing that fixed it. I'll put it that way.
I want to go back to the moment you received the Exceptional Man Award. Did that create disconnect inside your head and your heart? In other words, if you're pronounced exceptional man, what's the self-talk on the inside? And was there a disconnect then that pushed you either toward performance in order to be accepted, or away from it to hide in isolation because I'm not worthy? This is a lie. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I had this mixed emotion. What an insightful set of questions there, Christopher. Yeah, my first thought was I succeeded in fooling them, and so hang your hat on that. You have succeeded in portraying an image that you know deep down in your heart is not true. That you're not exceptional. That you're not special. That you're not to be celebrated. You're a fraud, and of course that's again the inner critic. And in some ways, I do think there were some guys on campus that deserved the award as much as I did or more. Like, in all honesty, but at the same time, I was feeling like I'm a fraud. I also wanted it to be put on display, to all of my peers. That in
there's
the
your validation.
In the most quote unquote humble way possible, to let
Sure.
everybody know that I had won this award for greatness. It's kind of messed up, but you asked for an honest answer, and so that's my honest answer.
Okay.
Very conflicted.
Well, I appreciate that because that resonates with me too. So many of us are trapped on the hamster wheel of do good, do bad, get bad, worse, do bad, you are bad. That's where the shame component comes into play. Now, just curious about this and how this plays out, how it played out for you. So I'm not going to generalize or assume anything, but let's just say there are a lot of people who resonate with this, and they may be type A driven achievers, right? Did you find yourself coping, if you will, Scott, by superimposing the demands you put on yourself upon others, which potentially could have led to your regret in the words that you dumped on other people? I'm not trying to turn this into a therapy session. I'm just deeply curious about this.
Yeah, there have been times where I've imposed pressure to do better and be better. That's a really popular phrase in today's climate. I actually despise that phrase. Do better, be better by itself can only be a condemning, unreachable ideal, right? Because we're all going to fall short. We all do fall short of whatever the ideal is, and so. So yeah, in my worst moments and seasons, and I think I've gotten more self-aware and better at this over time and over the years, but imposing too high of an expectation on my wife, on my kids, on my friends, on my staff, on church members, the list goes on. It's been a sporadic, I wouldn't say a consistent, but I would say a sporadic theme that has popped its head up every now and then in seasons where I wasn't at my healthiest. And thankfully, in virtually all of those seasons, there has been somebody who's been kind enough and courageous enough to say, Scott, that really hurt. Scott, let me tell you how I just experienced that conversation. And the one thing I'm grateful for is that, and I do also attribute this to the influence of Jesus Christ in my life. I am pretty quick to hear that kind of feedback and move toward repentance and repair where necessary, when called out or challenged on those sorts of things. And so yeah, but sometimes, right, we want to, because a lot of times other people's performance reflects on us, especially if we're in a position of leadership, which, for better or for worse, I've always been in a position of leadership as long as I've been alive, whether in sports or extracurriculars or in churches. I've always kind of ended up being the person in charge or part of the group of people in charge of things. And so you can, in this insidious, subtle way, attach, your own success and your own image to the success and image of the people around you that you're leading. And conversely, you can feel like you're failing if it feels like other people are making you or your thing or the thing you're in charge of look less shiny than you want it to look. And so there's a lot of gospel lessons in there to be learned, but that's definitely been part of the picture occasionally. Less and less over time, which I'm thankful for, but it's been there.
Well, if guilt says you made a mistake and shame says you are a mistake, what I'm really curious to explore with you, Scott, is why the interplay between the two becomes a distinction without a difference. Those are your words. Unpack this for us.
Between guilt and shame?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're familiar with the concept of caricature, right?
Yeah.
Christopher, so you can either positively caricature somebody, which I think is what we do.
Will you teach that out a little bit? Because maybe listeners today, viewers on here on YouTube, just don't know. Go ahead and play it out as if I don't know.
So a caricature is when you exaggerate a feature, right? So, think about political cartoons, right? And let's say, one party wants to make the other party look bad and its own party look good. They will draw two cartoons, let's say of the other party's presidential candidate, and if that candidate has like a wart on his face, or she has a big nose, that's exaggerated, and let's say the person on your side has beautiful eyes, and so those beautiful eyes are made bigger, right? It's called a caricature. It's an exaggeration of a feature in order to overly escalate or overly condemn the person that you're portraying. And so I think we so very easily reduce ourselves as well as others to a caricature, to whatever our worst feature is. That's oftentimes, especially for somebody who's sensitive to guilt and shame, whatever our worst features are, real or imagined, are the things that we attach our identity to. So, like me, like the battle that I was in that I was telling you about, the words I said 37 years ago, I said something mean. I actually apologized to the woman, and she repeatedly forgave me as I repeatedly apologized to her. Mm-hmm. But I was still never able to get over it entirely, obviously. But in that moment, 37 years later, I'm saying these condemning words out loud to myself over that incident long ago. In that moment, I am reducing my whole person to that one moment almost 4 decades ago. Like that, what happened in that one moment is who I am, which I know is not true, but in that moment I didn't feel it wasn't true. And emotions are such a powerful thing. And I'm the last person who wants to say, don't get so emotional. I think emotions are underplayed and undersold for their value, especially in Western culture. I think we should be more emotional, not less, but it's a question of whether we are healthy in the expression of our emotions and healthy in the stewardship of our emotions, whether we're talking about, guilt or shame. There are unhealthy and healthy versions of both, right? Like if I am guilty of insulting you or of lying to you, Christopher, then I'm guilty of that. And you call me out for it, and I feel ashamed, that's actually a healthy emotion unless it becomes my identity. A healthy version of guilt and shame will lead me to say, oh, I'm so sorry about that. Will you please help me understand more how you experienced that so I can fully apologize and fully do everything that I can to repair whatever it was that my actions did to hurt you. And so I can present it to God and receive full forgiveness from him. Like that's a healthy expression of guilt and shame. An unhealthy version are the things that we've been talking about, where we just stew on things that are actually over. They're over and done between us and the other person and the other party, or they're over and done between us and God because he, forgave it long, long ago. And so, anger is another one. There's a raging form of anger that destroys everything and everyone in its path and leaves things worse. There's a righteous form of anger that attacks problems without attacking people and has the effect of leaving the world better, like the civil rights movement, for instance, or, people who are defending the weak or fighting against, sex trafficking. Like that's an anger that's legitimate and righteous that has the effect of leaving the world better and leaving victims and vulnerable people in a more protected place. And so emotions can be used for beautiful purposes and life-giving purposes, or they can ruin us if we dwell in the unhealthy space with them and don't find a way out of that space.
Let's go back to what you were talking about around healthy guilt, healthy shame, because I'm curious about this. In the last 5, 6, 7 years, a dominant narrative in culture has been you are enough, self-esteem, self-love, and there's a place for that. But do you think the overextension of that messaging has actually then stunted, on the whole, our emotional growth, our emotional maturity?
So the truth in that statement, you are enough, is that you are enough in terms of your dignity and value and worth. Mm-hmm. No matter who you are, no matter what your life circumstances are, no matter what your belief system is, you are made in the image of God. And because you're made in the image of God, you have inestimable, incalculable, infinite value. So you are enough. You cannot create more value for yourself. No matter what your quote-unquote net worth is and those other measures that society uses to value the worth of a person, you are of infinite worth as far as your Creator is concerned. So you are enough in that regard. But none of us is enough with regard to virtue, with regard to being as good as we know we're supposed to be. None of us even lives up to our own standards, let alone the other standards that are put on us from the outside. And so I do believe that the "you are enough" message in that regard strips us of an opportunity to lean into our true identity, right? And what comes to mind too. So you're a millennial. I'm a Gen Xer. So I still have a faint memory of a Saturday Night Live character that you may or may not remember, because it was more for the boomer generation. But it was played by Al Franken, who's now a senator, and it was a character called Stuart Smalley, and he was this insecure guy, and his phrase was, "I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and people like me." And he kept repeating that mantra over and over and over again to deal with his deep, visceral, incontrovertible knowledge that he was not good enough and not smart enough, and people did not like him. And we can tell ourselves that we're enough all we want to, and we can listen to the gurus who tell us you just need to tell yourself you're enough, you're enough, you're enough. But I want to ask those who've been telling themselves I am enough for so many years without respect to God, how's it working out for you? I mean, has it made you feel more secure, more deeply rooted and planted in your identity, or has it taken you nowhere? And I would ask the question, for those of us who tell ourselves I am enough, I am enough, I am enough, why is it that you feel like you have to keep telling yourself that unless you feel like you're not? Unless you know deep down that by yourself and on your own, you're not, that you need the outside support of a community around you, for instance. You need the outside support of of the finished work of Jesus Christ. I'm speaking especially to those who identify as Christian there, that he has taken care of the guilt and shame. He's removed all guilt and condemnation by the finished work that he's done on your behalf at the cross. He's removed all shame by subjecting himself to be a public spectacle of shame, so that you would be covered. And the scriptures say you're clothed now with what the Bible calls the righteousness of Christ. And so as far as the Bible is concerned, and as far as God is concerned, he reckons you, to use biblical language. He sees you, he regards you as blameless, as if you were the one that lived the perfect life that Jesus lived, as if you were the one who earned it all, even though Jesus is the one who earned it all in your place and then paid the price for you not being able to live up to the "you are enough" mantra. So again, that's a long sermon there, but I would urge people who are stuck in a place of shame to rejoice in your high position of being made in the image of God. You are more than you feel like you are or than you think you are. And for those who are depending on the "you are enough" mantra to get you through the lifelong battle with guilt and shame, I would say rejoice in your low position, because it's on the ground where Jesus loves to meet people and heal them. The image comes to me of Jacob wrestling on the ground with God, or of the bleeding woman who is crawling on the ground to be able to touch the hem of Jesus's garment, and she's healed by what he has to offer on the ground in the low place, knowing that her best efforts have not been enough. And people can read that parable. They've not been enough to heal her. And you are not enough to heal you. You need God, and you need community around you to heal you.
Oh, I have to repeat what you just said, folks. You are not enough to heal you, Scott. This flies in the face of the messaging we even see today. I casually call it therapy in squares on Instagram. There's a therapy account on every other turn on Instagram, and I think a lot of this is being hidden because so many people today are going the route of benign spirituality, where the locus of authority is self. We're hanging our hat upon Freudian slogans: follow your heart, do what feels good, speak your truth, live your truth. And after hearing what you just said, I can't help but think some of it's just self-protection, because there's a deep woundedness on the inside, and we've not reconciled the fact that we just can't do this on our own. What do you think?
I think you're right. I'm looking for a quote here on self-esteem. I can't remember exactly what the source is, but it's this secular New York psychiatrist who's interviewed about self-esteem, and her answer, I wish I could give you the reference, but her conclusion is that self-esteem is actually bad for society. She says humility is what society needs, and community is what society needs, because self-esteem, as we define it, overlooks and tries to bury under the rug those things about us that cause harm not only to ourselves but to the people around us if we don't face them and deal with them out in the open. And so I wish I had the reference. I'll try to dig it up and send it to you, for your show notes. But even according to secular thinkers in this space, self-esteem has its liabilities. Humility and community, even the government in England recognizes this. They've just created a new position called the Minister of Loneliness. Because they know that. You've heard about that. So and I think they're causing the rest of the world to open up about the conversation about how so much of mental health challenges and issues are caused by isolation and by a me-centered existence. And the theory is, and I think it's a true one, is that part of the path to healing is to get out of ourselves and focus on others and on God and receive from others and from God and stop trying to work things out as if we had enough in ourselves to be the answer to our own hurts and pains and hardships and guilt and shame and all the rest.
Well, I'm just going to quote you from your book because you wrote this, and I just quickly found it in the galley copy here. A God in our own making is no God at all. You went on to write, as atheist philosopher Voltaire is quoted as saying, quote, in the beginning, God created man in his own image, and man has been trying to repay the favor ever since, end quote. There it is. Mm-hmm. There it is. Mm-hmm. Yet so many of us were continually drawn to the locus of self, locus of authority is self, and we've been disappointed, we've been hurt, we've been left alone, and we think, oh, I have to fix this for myself. Which perhaps even goes back to where we started our conversation with you today. Yeah. The deep early wounding that said to yourself, okay, now I have to build ego scaffolding to compensate with the liabilities that I feel on the inside. So, let's stay there. Because the climate of our souls steer our lives.
That's right.
You, Scott, have been immobilized by hypochondria. I'm really curious about this, and I'd love to hear this story because I think this actually does play into the internal narrative of I am fundamentally uncared for. I am fundamentally alone in this world. So this is real for a lot of people. It's been part of my story, if I can be candid and honest. So I'd love to just spend some time getting below the surface on this. Take us inside your history, however you're comfortable sharing around hypochondria. Let's talk about it.
Yes. So that's, hypochondria has been really more in my early life as an adult, especially the decade of my 20s. And, there were a couple of seasons where I feared that I might have a terminal disease, based on some symptoms that I had. And obviously, I'm 30 years into the future of that now, and I'm doing fine. But I think for me, it was really a crisis of realizing that I do not have the authority to write the story of my own life. As a young man, I had all of these dreams about what my future not only would be, but should be, and had created a bit of an ideal and of an idol of what my future ought to be, and so the thought of having a terminal illness interfered with my plans and with my illusion of control over my own life and my own story. Obviously, hypochondria can point to a lot of, deep internal things, for others that are different than my experience. But I think that's what it boiled down to for me.
Can I just ask, how did it manifest? What happened? If I were to go inside your story, fly on the wall, Monday afternoon, 20 years ago, what was going on? What happened? Because I think a lot of people listening today could say, yeah, Scott, that really is hitting me hard today. Validate that for them.
Yeah, so I developed symptoms that would be similar to a chronic fatigue syndrome, but with swollen lymph glands everywhere. And so I was convinced I had some kind of cancer, like a lymphoma or something like that. And there were enough swollen lymph glands that I thought this is a systemic problem. And my primary doctor said there wasn't enough evidence to, send me to an oncologist to check for that she just didn't think that I was at risk for that. And of course, I didn't believe my doctor. I was convinced that, I was onto something, that I was dying. Otherwise, why would I be so tired, et cetera? And it was probably, just some mysterious virus or something, but I had it for like 6 months. And so my fatigue also led to, and my emotional paralysis that went with the fatigue led to retreat into isolation. I couldn't concentrate in conversations. I had enough sense to realize that I probably wasn't a lot of fun to be around, because the only thing I wanted to talk about was, how sick I was or what have you. And so I went into retreat, which just made things worse and just caused it to snowball. And then, God put somebody in my life who said to me, Scott, this is an older authority figure, and this was one of many experiences that helped redeem some of my childhood story. Was an older man, tenderly saying to me, Scott, I really want to encourage you to talk to yourself more than you listen to yourself. And instead of trying to avoid the what if question, just stare your worst case scenario straight in the face. And as a Christian, remind yourself what your true long-term worst case scenario is. Where are you going to be in 150 years? Well, I'm going to be with Jesus in a perfect, healthy, life-giving, infinite future ahead of me, state. And where are you going to be in 250 years, in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years, in 1,000,000 years? And he says, talk to yourself more than you listen to yourself. And so this book project that I'm releasing here, called Beautiful People Don't Just Happen, How God Redeems Regret, Hurt, and Fear in the Making of Better Humans. That experience, which happened again in my mid-20s, was very formative in what would become later on in my life to this day a way of thinking that is represented in this book. And that way of thinking, when it gets deeply enough into us, also leads to a way of feeling and a way of hoping and a way of looking ahead. And I have more real health concerns now in my, early mid 50s that I feel completely unafraid about than I did in my 20s, when I didn't actually have anything to be actually concerned about. And a lot of that is just about learning as early in life as possible what it means to form our hearts and our minds to think according to the eternal perspective, and realize, as the Ecclesiastes writer says, remember your Creator in the days that you are young. Start helping yourself to think like God does about your life, and to define your life by the promises that are ahead of you, and get started as early as possible. Tim Keller is my friend and mentor, pastor in New York. He's got an incurable cancer right now in his mid-70s, and he says quite regularly that this is the happiest season of his life. And what makes him that way is that he has such a deep confidence that's been formed over more than 60 years of being in the Bible every single day of his life, praying through 5 Psalms every day for over 60 years, reading through the whole Bible every year for over 60 years, having a deep prayer life every day for that same period of time. And, he's been formed to see the world and to even see sickness, suffering, and death in a way that's hopeful, but it's not a wishful thinking kind of hope. It's actually anchored in the fact that Jesus Christ has risen from the dead and made these promises for us as well. So I don't know how I got onto that, except to say that this whole notion that my older friend taught me about learning to talk to ourselves with the counter voice of God, to address our untrue thoughts, is where it's at. In terms of doing our part to contribute to our own mental and emotional health and flourishing. Now, there are some clinical and chemical challenges that, for a lot of people that require, the expertise of like psychology and psychiatry as well. It's what Christians call common grace. I would not say that repeating Bible verses to yourself is going to be the total answer for everybody. I myself, I have a counselor that I work with who helps me with just the physiology of things and the psychology of things. But when you put healthy psychology and healthy physiology together with a healthy, robust, scripture-shaped way of thinking, you're in your best position to promote health in yourself and others.
When you were talking about Tim Keller, you were saying he's been formed. And I want to put a stake in the ground for a moment, because all of us are being formed. Formation is not a Christian thing, it's a human thing. The question is who and what is doing the forming. And so I'd like those of you joined in this conversation with Scott and me to take a moment to reflect and audit your thought life, audit your thinking patterns, your default mindsets, the narratives that are running through your head, and ask yourself, who and what is forming me? Am I being formed according to truth, or am I being formed according to a wishy-washy, flimsy cultural narrative that is telling me anything other than things that are going to set me free, things that are going to challenge me, things that are going to cause me to become really the best that I've been called to be? So I just wanted to take a little tangent there for a second and talk to the listener, Scott, because I think this is so important. Now, go back to the moment of what your friend told you, thinking differently, choosing the areas of focus. Proverbs 15:15 says this: all the days of the desponding and afflicted are made evil by anxious thoughts and forebodings, but he who has a glad heart has a continual feast, regardless of circumstances. I am fascinated by that. Here's why. Is because it says all the days of the already afflicted people are made evil by forebodings. Now, this goes back to hypochondria and the rumination of anxious thoughts. What do you think, Scott? Is it about the soul state of people already afflicted that opens them up to irrational fear and rumination? So, reflect that upon your own story. Lymph nodes are popping, chronic fatigue, that causes rumination, that creates a soul state. What is it about that soul state of people who are already being afflicted by something that just continues to open them up to this rumination and destructive thinking and ways of just behaving?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we are wired by our Creator to think in terms of what I'll call first fruits. Right?
Okay.
The Bible says that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the first fruits of things that are to come. In other words, the first fruits are an apple tree. The first apple comes, 1,000 other apples are going to come really soon. Mm-hmm. The resurrection of Jesus happens, that billions of future resurrections are to occur because that one has happened. And I think when we're kind of out of our minds, we adopt a first fruits perspective on present trial, that this is only the beginning. It's only going to get worse. This is only a sign of the remaining doom that is yet to come. My life is already over. My best days are already behind me. And so again, it goes back to the formation question. What is it that we're going to ruminate on? Are we going to ruminate on imagined hypothetical worst case scenarios that may or may not occur? Or are we going to ruminate on the future promises of God, which indicate that our long-term worst case scenario is resurrection and everlasting life, which enables us to live in present sorrow with hope and with a sense of optimism about where not only history is headed, but our history is headed. And so, I think that first fruits insight, there's something to that in both directions.
Well, my observation and experience with this has also led me to understanding the need to receive healing for a broken spirit. I mean, just tipping my hat to Tim Keller. He had a brilliant message on the wounded spirit. Proverbs 18:14 says that the strong spirit of a man can bear up under trial or persecution. And then he asks this great question: who can bear up under a broken spirit? I think that's systemic. I think that's a root issue. Like, what's your take on receiving healing for a broken, wounded spirit? It is crushing.
Yeah, I mean, I've been there. I've been in some pretty deep, dark places, and again, I think that it's essential to have both the truth and community around you that echoes the truth, not only to your heart but to your ears. Bonhoeffer has this statement about community where he says, "The word of Christ on my brother's lips is stronger than the word of Christ in my heart." In other words, you holding a Bible, reading promises that directly address my pain and my fears, with promises that Christ is present with me always, even to the very end of the age, that he's for me, not against me, that he has plans to prosper me and not to harm me, plans to give me a hope and a future, that, the new heaven and the new earth is coming, where there'll be no more death, mourning, crying, or pain, for the old order of things will have passed away and everything will be made new, that even thorns in the flesh have redemptive purposes to them, as the story of the Apostle Paul reminds us, that it's in weakness that the power of God shines through, even when we don't see it, even when we don't feel it. That Isaiah, who only knew suffering and never saw the fruit of his ministry in his lifetime, and his life ended by being sawn in two by people who hated him and hated his message. And yet he was the one in the midst of all of that who wrote the words, "God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his ways are higher than our ways." He is the one who gave us those magnificent words about the one who will reign on David's throne, and of the increase of his government and reign there will be no end. Isaiah, from those dismal circumstances. And then maybe you remind me as well, Christopher, in that when I'm in that low place, that every single book of the Bible was written by a person who was either a slave or an exile, or their land had been occupied by a hostile, more powerful enemy, or they were in prison, or they were awaiting their own execution when they wrote the Bible. With very rare exceptions, the whole Bible was written from those contexts, as if to say to me that God, the place where God shows up is the places where we actually think he's absent, but he's actually more there than he is anywhere else in our lives. To hear that from you, with your Bible open in front of me, is infinitely more powerful than me reading it alone in private, even though that has its own power to it. Hearing it in community and experiencing the encouragement of it in community, and being able to draft off of others' faith when I feel weak in mine. I get that image of Aaron and Hur lifting Moses' arms because he was too weary to lift his own. There's just a power to that, and I think Bonhoeffer really captured something real and meaningful when he made that statement about the word of Christ on my brother's lips being stronger than the word of Christ in my heart.
In so many ways, that's encouraging, because that gives us the ability to see, as the statement says, to see the forest for the trees, to have a long-range perspective. So maybe people are saying today, Scott, I get it, I just don't like it. Yeah.
And that's the other piece I was going to add to that, Christopher, is the people that you want in your community, people who have been there, and maybe people who are just barely on the other side. Can I read the quote that inspired the writing of the book? This is from Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, and I think this might help your listeners. She's writing, this is from her book called Death, the Final Stage of Growth. She did not share my Christian faith. But and I think any therapist, anyone in psychology or psychiatry would also affirm this to be true. Any human who's ever suffered and found comfort in others showing up for them would probably concur with this as well. But she says this. She says the most beautiful people we've known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen.
There it is.
There it is.
Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, folks, we've talked about this here on the show. She is the pioneer of the 5 stages to grief. And then, of course, with David Kessler, had some other material, and then Kessler came out with sort of the 6th stage, talking about meaning and finding meaning in grief, and it's super important. But Scott, I want to go back to sort of the statement I put a pin in regarding, hey, this is real, I get it, I just don't like it. That introduces cynicism. Like, through your story, through the shame, did you ever take on a cynical view of God, his purposes, and even your life? Because I think cynicism, if we're not careful, is en route to unbelief. But I'd love to pave another path for people who are hurting today.
Yeah. I've certainly been cynical about certain people. I've been cynical about myself.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been cynical about God for more than 5 seconds. And I think that's just an indication of the goodness of God to me to protect me from going down that route. Even in those seasons where he just felt so and seemed so invisible and silent, I just, the fact that Jesus voluntarily endured what he did on our behalf just always makes me come short of pointing my finger at him for anything, because of the pain and rejection and betrayal and abandonment and alienation that he endured voluntarily. And so when I'm faced with involuntary lesser hardship, it's very hard being aware of what Jesus went through for our sake to become cynical about him. Cynical about circumstances, cynical about a fallen world, cynical about how poorly people can treat each other, 100%. Cynical about abuse and mistreatment of others, absolutely. Cynical about the nature and character of God. I just thankfully have never gone there for very long. I've had shouting matches. I've had one-way shouting matches with God, for sure, but it never felt like cynicism toward him.
I'm glad you said that. You've had one-way shouting matches with God, because I think sometimes we package our pain in cute little religious packages because we think that's the way to do it. But I tend to believe that we're not going to receive the full comfort he offers unless we fully mourn. You lost your mom within the last year, if I'm not mistaken.
A couple years ago now, but yeah,
okay.
At the writing of the book, it had been within the last year.
You said you didn't shed any tears when she died. Why not?
Well, she had Alzheimer's, and so we'd been saying goodbye to her in increments for 10 years. And so we'd had probably 100 or more seasons of loss and grief. And so it was all spread out over the course of 10 years. And by the time she passed, we were actually more relieved than we were anything else, because there was really nothing left of her except her body and her vital organs. So her brain had essentially checked out long ago.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Scott.
Thank you. It's a terrible disease, Alzheimer's. Yes. Avoid it as much as you can.
Yes. Well, I'm just curious, Scott, what did you learn about grief in experience a couple years ago that was different than maybe you had been told or even read?
I learned that grief is good. I write in the book about how important lament is to living in a healthy way, to speak out loud our distressed, sad, hurting emotional life, and to do that in the context of community, not to bleed on other people, but to ask for community and for help and for support, and also to cry out in community for the encouragement that things like the Psalms can bring on somebody else's lips, right? I learned a lot about how God wants us to engage with him in our seasons of regret, hurt, fear, sorrow during that season, because I spent a lot of times in the Psalms, and that's kind of the prototypical prayer book, right? And every emotion is expressed just so openly, so honestly, and that's just part of the healing process. And I even think of Jesus at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, and he knows that in just a few minutes he's going to perform a miracle and bring his friend up from the dead and out of the grave. But he takes time to weep. He takes time to live in community with others who are grieving and mourning, especially Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha. And it also says that he gets, in the original language, it says that he gets raging mad at death and what it does, the vandal that death is to human beings and human community. And so, just being able to process my own grief in light of how Jesus processed his, and in light of how, King David or refugee David, depending on the season in which he wrote the psalm, processed his, was just really helpful. It feels more fully human to be able to lament, which is not a popular thing in Western society.
No.
But it's a necessary thing for spiritual and emotional health to be able to do it. One of my friends and fellow pastors here at our church in Nashville, his name is Russ Ramsey, and he's got this great quote. It's probably my favorite quote about lament. He says, "Lament is a necessary skill in the art of rejoicing." In other words, it is only to the degree that we can do business with our pain that we can actually authentically rejoice. Because joy is actually a reaction. It's a response to the relief of all the different kinds of distress that we experience from all the different kinds of pain. And that relief either comes through actual relief, or it comes through the relief of knowing that eventually God's going to relieve it, resting in the promises, as the scriptures talk about. But we can't truly and fully rejoice except to the degree that we have fully and truly been able to lament. C.S. Lewis talks about how heaven will work backwards and turn even agony into a glory. And I think there's something in there for those who might feel reluctant to express their grief.
That's so rich, Scott. I think a great place to land this conversation is going back to the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross quote, because it tips its hat to the title of your book. And she said this again: "The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths." Scott, what makes those people beautiful in your estimation?
I mean, you think about how a diamond is formed, right? It's a piece of coal that has unbearable pressure placed on it, right? This large, black piece of dust, compressed to a certain degree, becomes this perfectly clear, gemstone. I talk in the book too about my favorite pastry called banana bread, and the key ingredient being a rotten banana. And it's
I
a
love
great
it too.
It's a great metaphor, because like the baker mixes the rotten banana in with all the other ingredients, works them all together, right? Turns the heat up on it, and it comes out wonderful. And that's the way that God works the ingredients in our lives out. The rotten ones and the sweet ones. He works it all together for good. It says for those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. And you just become a more compassionate, empathetic person who's able to show up in ways that a superficial person is not. Who has avoided the hard and low places all their lives and sought to inoculate themselves from any form of experiencing a fallen and broken world, tends to produce a superficial person. But the people who live in the world with great depth, are the ones who've been to the depths in one way, shape, or form.
That's a powerful place to land, Scott. And I'd love for you to just take the floor and speak right to the listener. Coming out of this conversation, maybe they're in a state of grief right now. Maybe they're in active turmoil right now. Not to reduce this down to life hacks, but if they were to reframe and create action out of this, what would you want them to do?
It's going to sound really simple. Do the work on your heart that you need to do in the smoother seasons of life to prepare for the rockier ones. Back to the Tim Keller story. The joyful man that he is now in his hardest, most difficult season of life comes from the hard daily work of drawing as close as he knew how to his Lord and Savior every day of his life for over 60 years. Readiness for the curveballs that life can throw at us it can't be cooked up like a microwave. It's a slow cook, as they say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so start as early as you can doing the good work of forming your mind and your heart with things that are good and true and beautiful and excellent and lovely and praiseworthy, like the Apostle Paul wrote from prison to the church in Philippi, right? That starts with being fully present with Jesus every single day. And I would say rather boldly, if I might, be fully present with a healthy, life-giving local church every single Sunday of your life. Don't compromise that. Don't let other things crowd it out to make it less than a number one priority on your list of priorities. Because that's actually Jesus's incubator for health. And I realize that churches can be messy and hard and difficult, but sometimes that's how we actually become more healthy people, by rooting ourselves into community and working out the hard things through confession, forgiveness, redemption, renewal. But I just don't know any other healing community quite like the local church, with all of its warts and all of its wonders. So in addition to that, have 2 or 3 people in your life who will show up for you if you're in a ditch, and who you would show up for if they were in a ditch, and just covenant together to stay close and to stay in community. And good counseling is always helpful. And, some people will say, well, I live in a small town, and so we don't really have good counselors here. But, one of the things the pandemic has given us is there are all these online options now
100%.
of face-to-face counseling with really good, gifted therapists. And so that is now a more ubiquitous, available option for folks as well. So I'm a super fan of good counseling as well.
Yeah, I am too. The book, Beautiful People Don't Just Happen. There's a link in the show notes right now at wintoday.tv. So go there now, get a copy, get 50 copies, give them away. Honestly, guys, it's a really good read, and I think it's going to add value to you. It's going to turn the page to even the conversation Scott and I've had here today. So, Scott, I'm just so thankful. What a great conversation. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher. I appreciate it. It's good being with you.